I'm Melissa Shanahan, and this is the Velocity Work Podcast, episode number 121. This podcast is for attorneys who are running their own firms. We explore tactics, tools, and stories related to pushing past simply lawyering well and into building a successful firm. Working in your firm and working on your business are two very different things. This podcast focuses on the latter. Hello! That's my impression of Mitch Zoll, who is in one of our sprint groups, the 8 a.m. group, Mountain Time. And every morning we show up, that's what he does. Hello! Except it's way better than what I'm doing right now. But it's in my head all the time. I just push record. That's what came out. That's why it came out. So if you're in that sprint group, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if not, you're missing out. Mitch is awesome. And he's a draw in our sprints. That's for sure. Well, okay. Let's dig into today's stuff. Have you ever had a concept in your mind that made total sense to you? You don't know if it makes sense to other people or not. You never really had to be concerned about it until there comes a point where you do try to articulate the concept in your mind or the belief in your mind. And it's tough. It's actually very difficult to explain and provide context and help it land in a way that it can be received by whoever you're trying to explain it to. I have had that recently. And it's so funny. This doesn't happen all that often, although it happens more than probably the average person, because I have to explain concepts on this podcast that are not always easy to explain. So I think I deal with this more than the average, but I don't know. And recently I've had one that has been more difficult than the average experience that I've had when I'm trying to articulate a concept. And here's how this came about. When I was looking for guests for the new show, Velocity Work Live, that we do, which the audio is pumped into the podcast feed. Also, I should note that we are taking a break in October because I know we just started it, but October, my calendar was already so full, it didn't make sense. We're just going to pick it back up in November because there's more space in my calendar. We can carve that time out. So we did, and that's where we'll pick it back up in November for all of you who might be noticing that the Thursday podcast isn't there at the moment. That's why. Well, okay, so the guests that I wanted for that show when we first set out to do this, I did not just want any business owner on this show. I wanted business owners who had created the business that they wanted to create. And now, even though there may still be growth targets and they're still involved in the business, they're not working more hours than they want to. They are not involved in the heavy lifting of things. They are not involved in a lot of the complexity. They're doing the work that they enjoy doing. And they choose what they work on. And they have freedom. There's this sense of freedom that they have with the business that they've created. Most business owners aren't there yet. I don't know if you've noticed that, but I've noticed it because as I'm looking for people to have on the show, the people I'm looking for are in the minority of business owners. Most business owners haven't really figured out how to get themselves to that place. So it's not slim pickings. I mean, there's plenty out there, but I have to work really hard to find beyond my network where there's not a big list in my network that are at that place. There's probably 18 or 20. Beyond that, like I have to really work to get it. And what I'm noticing is that people around me don't understand what I mean, which is so fascinating to me. Like they don't get it. My team has suggested people and I'm like, no, that doesn't fit the bill, you know? So I like that they're coming up with suggestions, but what I'm realizing is it's very hard to articulate the kind of person that I want on the show. I do not want just any business owner on the show. I want the business owner that's created this thing that I'm talking about for themselves. Well, then I happened to hear a podcast. There's a podcast that a friend of mine runs. It's called Free Time with Jenny Blake. She's a dear friend of mine, and she has big name guests on. She has like Seth Godin and Cal Newport and James Altucher. Like it's a sample of the kinds of guests that she's had on. This is her second podcast. It's Free Time with Jenny Blake. So this is a newer podcast, but one of the guests that she has had on this round, his name is Jonathan Fields. If you don't know who Jonathan Fields is, I don't really know how to explain. I don't actually know what his businesses are, but he's a writer and a creator. And he has had a project where he interviews people for a long time called the Good Life Project. And that's been turned into a podcast over the years. So he was on her show and she asked him about a concept that I think he coined this concept, and he calls it the unfortunate middle. And I've never heard her talk about this before. I've never heard him talk about this before. But so this conversation blew my mind. So they get into the concept, and he's essentially saying when you start a business, there's 3 phases, right, that you can be in as a business owner. And the first phase he calls simple grace. And that is where there's a simplicity about how you run your business, in that it's you and maybe an assistant or someone who helps, coordinate and things like that. But it's really just you, and you're very in tune with the clients and in touch with the clients. And that's it. Like, there isn't scale, and you don't want that. It's just kind of, there's simple grace to that. Every business typically starts here and creates this simple grace for themselves. But most business owners don't want to stay here. They do want to scale. And they actually got into this really cool conversation about, Jenny said, I want to stay there. Like, I want that simplicity, but it doesn't feel like there's security in that. And so I don't want to stay there. And they talked about that. And he was like, no, it's actually, you could have a really great life and make a good living and have enough insurance that God forbid something goes wrong and it took you out for some reason, you would still be taken care of. And so would your family, et cetera. So they kind of had that conversation about, like, it's a myth that it has to be insecure to stay in simple grace. So that was kind of interesting. Then they talk about that at some point, if you do want to scale, if you do want to move beyond that, then you have to introduce complexity into the business. That's a part of the deal. So there's more automation. So, we think of, in the conversation we often have as a community, at least the conversations I have with you law firm owners, is that there is a simplicity in adding in technology and making it so that you don't have to manually cross your T's and dot your I's. There's automation and technology that can come into it. But that is complexity that's being added into the business. And that sort of made my brain skits for a second, because as a facilitator, my job is to really guide people towards simplicity, not complexity, except when I was listening to this, that is actually not true. That's what I tell myself, and that's how I think about it. But truthfully, complexity has to be added into the business. There are more responsibilities that come when you start to scale. And there are more positions and people that you need to hire. And there's more technology. There's more scenarios that can be run in terms of client scenarios. And so there's complexity with how to deal with each of those. So all these things, right? Like, there is complexity that has to be a part of the business if you're going to grow beyond just you and your person and, maybe a little bit of help and staying very close to all of it. And that, as I was listening to the conversation, and I highly recommend it. It's in the show notes if you want to access that podcast episode. But I was thinking about this and I loved the conversation they were having. I was just really enjoying it. And thinking about the complexity, and they're talking about, the reason that you go for that, the reason that you do choose to play that game is so that because you want it to be able to run in a way where you can step back and experience complex grace. So you have simple grace at some point with the business. And then if you choose to grow and scale, you have to introduce complexity, and you can get yourself to the place where you experience complex grace. I was like, oh, geez, this is so good. And then this was like the kicker for me. Then he talked about the middle is called, between simple grace and complex grace, is called the unfortunate middle, because no one gets to complex grace with grace. No, you have to go through the unfortunate middle of really being in it. And it's a grind, and there's some hustle involved. There's more hours involved oftentimes to get it to the place where you are introducing complexity into the business. You've got to be right there with it. And then eventually you can hire other people to take over some of those pieces, and et cetera, and you can take a step back and experience complex grace. But the unfortunate middle, you don't not get to experience that. And he was talking about how most business owners will stay in the unfortunate middle because for a number of reasons. They don't have the guts to make the right calls to get to experience complex grace for themselves. Like they hold on to everything. They don't trust someone else to come in. They don't handle that process very well. So that will keep them stuck in the middle. And you can't go back to simple grace at that point because you got all this complexity and you won't trust somebody else. So you just keep yourself in the unfortunate middle and you never get to experience complex grace. That was really interesting to me. There's other reasons that they talked about, but if you sit and think about for a second, where are you? Are you in simple grace or are you in the unfortunate middle? I know for sure there are very few of you that are experiencing complex grace. And the reason that I loved the way that he articulated this, it's like a frame in his mind of how it works. And I think it is spot on because most of the people I'm working with, maybe all of the people I'm working with are in the unfortunate middle. And there are a few, there are private clients that are just on the cusp of complex grace. And it won't be long. They could taste it, right? But there isn't anyone yet that isn't out of the unfortunate middle. I think some are on the upper end of the unfortunate middle where they're getting ready to cross over, like I said, but everybody's in the unfortunate middle. Everybody's supposed to be at some point. And one thing that I loved that he wrote in, I'm going to see if I can find this, about the unfortunate middle. There's a couple things that stood out to me when I was reading about online. I was trying to find more information about him writing this, and I found some, but the conversation to me on the podcast was just like the best. But one thing I saw him write was, you're stuck in the utterly untenable space between simple grace and complex grace. It's a glorious, catastrophic, and sublimely consuming cocktail of possibility and pain. I mean, come on. I'm going to read that again. The unfortunate middle is where you are when you're stuck in the utterly untenable space between simple grace and complex grace. It's a glorious, catastrophic, and sublimely consuming cocktail of possibility and pain. It just sounds like truth to me. There's like a vibration that happens inside of me when I read that that's like truth. It's my truth radar. And there was something else that I read in one of his pieces that he has on the interwebs that says the unfortunate middle is not to be sustained, it's to be passed through. And people don't understand that. And that if you can't understand that your job is to pass through this, you can get to complex grace more quickly. And I think just having that frame, that mental frame around simple grace, the unfortunate middle, and complex grace will allow people to be able to make moves that otherwise they couldn't, because it helps to know where you are. Where are you in your journey? And being able to pinpoint that's just something our human brain loves and eats up, and it creates more possibility. You can see so much more if you can see where you are on a bit of a map. And, this is a conceptual map, but I hope you see what I'm saying. So I wanted to share this with you today because I think it's important to provide some sense of framework for you and for you to find yourself on that. And the reason I'm bringing this up with what I was talking about with the Velocity Work Live interviews is because that is who I'm looking for. People who are experiencing complex grace. That is it. And like I said, I've got clients that are just on the cusp of that. And so I will be having them on ASAP with that. But there's a list of people that I've got that I know them well enough to know they are experiencing complex grace. And now I'm on the hunt for people that I don't know personally that are experiencing complex grace. And I want to interview them. I want them to share their wisdom with you because their answers, people who are experiencing complex grace, their answers are much different to my questions about how they operate, how they think about things, barriers, challenges. They're much different than people who are in the unfortunate middle and how they answer those questions. Now it's like, okay, now I have a framework to point people to say, here, this is the spot that I want people from, this complex grace. And I can tell it's landing with people around me now. They're like, oh, I get it. They totally get who I'm looking for to interview. So I thought I would share that with you. So that is it. The whole point of this podcast is to give you that concept and let it blow open your mind so that you can kind of find yourself and where you are in this framework and let it pull you in one direction or the other. And listen, complex grace is not better than simple grace. there is grace about the simplicity of simple grace, meaning there's a lot of meaningful and fulfilling work that you can experience there and a good quality of life and make great money and have simplicity there. That's a choice, right? It's going to look very different, but most people that are involved with Mastery Group, they don't want that. They do want to see what they're capable of in terms of what can they build that has complexity in it, but that runs really well and smoothly and serves clients so well and allows them to take a step back and work only the hours that they want to, and allows them to take the vacations that they want to, and allows them to plug into the work that delights them the most, and allows them to have people working for them that fit the team really well. And there's this vibe in the culture of the organization. Like all of that is, most of the people that I work with, that excites them. But then they get in the unfortunate middle, which they have to pass through, and they get stuck there because it's just really hard for them to see how to get to complex grace. And I think having this framework alone, just knowing of the framework and where you are in it, is immensely helpful to help you start to cross the bridge to get to complex grace. Start to be able to make the calls that you need to make in order to create that reality for yourself. So I hope it's helpful for you. All right, everybody, enjoy your week. I'll see you here next Tuesday. Hey there. If you enjoyed this podcast, I highly recommend you come and check out Mastery Group. It is where owner attorneys come together to study this material, apply it, and thus create really big results for their firm and for their life. So come on over, velocitywork.com/join to get more information and get started. Show notes from this episode can be found at velocitywork.com/podcast.